Hello and welcome everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us today. It's great to see so many people starting to get logged in for our discussion. My name is Kate Schwanhauser, and I'm the events manager here at Food and Water Watch. And I am the host of this monthly Livable Future Live virtual event series. And I just want to start by wishing everyone a very happy Earth Week. As I'm sure many of you know, the Earth Day official theme this year is Planet versus Plastic. And stopping the plastic pollution crisis is something that we care deeply about here at Food and Water Watch. So all week we are raising awareness about the problem and solutions. And I just want to thank you all for engaging in this important work by being here today to learn more and to take action with us. So we're going to get into all of that in just a minute, but as people continue to log in, I'll just go over a couple of quick reminders and share some announcements for a few upcoming events. So first, if you need to turn on closed captioning to add subtitles to your screen, just click on the captions button that you see in your Zoom toolbar to turn those on. And you can continue to use the chat box during the event as a space to share your thoughts and have a conversation with fellow attendees here today. And we'll also be sharing some links to resources in the chat for you, so keep an eye out for those. And we are going to save some time today for Q&A with our guest speaker. So if you have questions for her as you're listening, go ahead and drop those in the Q&A box and we'll take some of those at the end. And finally, I am recording today's conversation, so I'll share that with everybody a little bit later this week. Before we get started, just a quick background on Food and Water Watch for those of you who might be new here. We are a national organization fighting for sustainable food, clean water, and a livable climate for all of us. And one of the main ways that we do this is by mobilizing grassroots power to push for policy change and hold corporations accountable. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with our grassroots organizing work to fight for policy change at the local, state, and federal level. And together, thanks to the dedication and commitment of people like all of you here today, we are holding elected officials accountable and pressing for solutions to stop the plastic crisis, among many of our other campaigns to protect our food, water, and climate. And I do just want to let you all know that in honor of Earth Day, we do have a special matching gift opportunity this week. So any gift that you make today will be matched 3 to 1. So that's 4 times the impact that you can have on our work to stop the plastic pollution crisis. Food and Water Watch doesn't take any corporate money, but that's, exactly who we're up against in this fight, corporations with some really deep pockets. So that just means that it's people like all of you who really make this fight possible. If you would like to make a gift today and have it matched, you can click the link in the chat or text the word gift to the number 23321. And finally, I also just want to invite you to join us for some other upcoming events and volunteer opportunities that we have in the coming weeks. So tomorrow, actually, as part of our Earth Week activities, we are launching our Plastics Action Team with a kickoff call from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern. You can join that to learn more about how you can get plugged into volunteer opportunities to fight plastic pollution. And then I invite you to join us again in June for our next Livable Future Live event. We can solve the climate crisis. I think we hear, just so much negativity, negative news about the climate crisis, but I think it's important to keep in mind that we actually already have the majority of the solutions that we need to live sustainably. The challenge is just harnessing our collective willpower to turn that into political action. A big challenge for sure, but one that I know that together we can overcome. So you can join us in June to learn more about what it is that we're getting right and how together we can amplify that work to create broader change for our communities and the planet. And we'll put some links in the chat where you can sign up for both of those events. All right, so let's go ahead and get to today's topic, planet versus plastic. As you know, plastic is everywhere, quite literally. It's polluting our oceans, it's littering our green spaces, it's even breaking down into tiny microplastics particles that are getting into our food, our water, even the air that we breathe. And despite the relatively short history of plastics as we know them today, they've certainly had a really outsized impact on our lives and our planet. So how did we get here and what can we do about it? That is what we're going to talk about today with our guest expert. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Rebecca Altman. She is an environmental sociologist who studies and writes about the social history of chemistry, plastics, pollution, and their environmental legacy. She's done and published really extensive research on this subject, and she currently serves on the board of directors for the national think tank Science and Environmental Health Network, where she's worked on projects to stop fossil fuel infrastructure and the rights of future generations to a livable planet. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rebecca Altman for being here with us today. Hi. Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry.
No
Hello,
worries.
everyone. Hi, Kate.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much again for joining us. I'm really excited to dig into our conversation. I know we've got a lot of really interesting stuff to cover. So I think maybe let's just start with the basics at the beginning. I was watching a TED Talk that you gave a few years ago, and in it you say, "Plastic runs in my blood." Could you explain what you meant by that? Because I think for you, it has a little bit of a double meaning, and just share with us what got you focused on researching plastics as the focus of your career.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for having me on, and it was wonderful to see the chat fill up with place names from all over the country. It's incredible. Okay, so yes, plastics run in my blood. It had started out as a very tongue-in-cheek way of saying that I'm the daughter of a plastics maker. My dad made plastics in the 1960s during the era of The Graduate, when that iconic phrase "plastics," this great future in plastics. He made plastics during that era, and then left shortly thereafter. By the time I knew him, he was the recycling coordinator in my hometown, a very different man. And so, but he got himself. Well, I'll just say it this way. Part of what had come to light in the years that I was growing up was that the plant where he had worked was involved with a pollution incident in the southern part of New Jersey that ended up being linked with uh, incredible levels of water pollution and potentially associated with the cancers that were either taking kids or kids were living with. And anyway, that was one of the major stories that I kind of was reckoning with as I was coming of age. And so exactly 40 years after he started making plastics, I began studying their history and legacy at Brown. But now when I say plastics run in my blood, it feels really different, especially in light of recent years where we actually now do have scientific evidence that plastics are in blood. And so now when I say it, I'm still taken aback by that new line of evidence that's coming in pretty hard and quick right now about all of the different organ systems in which plastics has taken up residence.
Thanks for sharing a little bit of that. It's such an interesting history that you have with your family and how you got into this. So, plastic is in and of itself a huge concept. It's one that's wrapped in with so many other things. And as a researcher, I'm sure you really had endless avenues that you could have chosen to explore, but you specifically chose the social history of chemistry, plastics, and the legacy that they have in our environment, and as you mentioned, our bodies. So why do you think it's so important that we, approach it from that lens and look back at the history to really understand where we are today?
I mean, there's a couple things I could say about that, but I think one of the most basic ones is if you study the history of monitoring bodies for pollutants, monitoring blood like a river, for example. Like I've spent quite a bit of time looking at the history of that science. And oftentimes what happens is we get this exposure data way out in front of the health and safety data to interpret what those exposures mean. And so it becomes very difficult to be able to understand what it means that, for example, there's X parts per million of so-and-so in one's bloodstream. And it strikes me that there's another way to read that science as a sociologist or as someone kind of working with historical methods, which is the same way a dendrochronologist might read the rings of a tree. Or in the words of Dr. Sandra Steingraber, we've become living scrolls, living archives of essentially 20th century decisions, policy decisions about what is to be made and how it is made. And so it seemed to me the method for beginning to interpret and understand this biological incursion of pollutants into bodies. If these substances are to be intimate with us, as intimate as science suggests they now are, for example, plastics in lungs and placentas and breast milk and brain tissue, then shouldn't we be as intimate with them? Shouldn't we know something about their stories? And so I began working on these kind of chemical and plastic biographies to really understand where they came from and how we came into such intimate contact with them. And I wanted to get beyond just the basic stories of what I call the Fs, the kind of firsts, the founders and the fathers of technology, which don't really tell us anything about where these materials come from without looking at the wider circumstances, including political circumstances that enabled them and that fostered their development. So, so that's the basic why for me behind the work that I'm doing, which is to kind of tell the stories of the things that have become intimate to us and to understand that their presence in our bodies, even if we can't yet interpret the health data, or even as the health data is starting to form a pattern or weight of evidence about what it means. In the meantime, it's a historical story that our bodies, that we are waking, walking archives of these decisions. And then we can talk more, if this is where folks want to go, about what's the value of understanding particular components of plastics history in policy decisions and even global treaties now. But I'll pause there and see where you want to take it.
Yeah, that's great. I think we definitely do want to dig into, yeah, how that impacts the decisions that we need to start making today. But I wonder if first maybe you could just share a little bit of those, the biography of plastics that you mentioned, and give us a little bit of that history and, where did plastic initially come from? And how did we get to plastics as we know them today?
So, oftentimes when you open up like a journalistic coverage of plastics, they'll do a nod, a nod to where plastics come from. And the most often story that is told, it kind of ends up being told so often, it kind of more functions like myth. But you hear this story about this 19th century era billiards ball manufacturer desperate for ivory for making more billiard balls, and so put up a contest, and along comes good old John Wesley Hyatt, who invents plastic, and boom, there we are. But it's like that's the way plastics history is often told, and it misses everything about it. And so which is to say there was a whole other industry going on, and whose foundation was already laid before the American Civil War, producing essentially like the same kinds of moldable and insulating materials from natural rubber. And we tend not to think about that as a plastic, but it is in fact a modified, chemically and heat modified natural polymer, but it's still used in all of the same ways that plastics would be in the coming decades. And why does it matter? Well, it was one of the first global industries. It produced some of the first industrial barons. It was some of the first stocks traded. It was a globally expansive industry based on incredible human rights violations in order to extract the raw material, and incredibly chemically intensive factories to then manipulate and chemically alter the rubber into products, including, for example, the entire telegraph network laid underneath the oceans was enabled because of the harvesting of a particular kind of latex called gutta percha from Southeast Asia. And some scholars have called the harvesting of that level of rubber the equivalent of a Victorian era ecological disaster. And then what workers inside of those factories had to deal with in order to make that rubber, what the communities around those factories, for example, Silvertown, an area of London, had to deal with in terms of pollution to make all of that rubber to line the telegraph wires that then allowed the continents to be linked and to allow Europe, and particularly the British Empire, to administer itself, is probably starts to sound like a very familiar story. So hard rubber is really where this story begins, and it lays the foundation for how plastics, subsequent generations of plastics would be layered and built up. And it would be one in which it was heavily subsidized by nations, was wrapped up in the projects of war making and national expansion and empire, incredibly toxic, human rights violations up and down the supply chain. And this is even before plastics became disposable. So it's suggestive that the problem is much bigger than just an end of waste. Oh, that's my dog who has comments about my son coming home. I'm sorry. It suggests plastics is a much bigger issue than just what we can see collecting in the oceans, and that it has been for a long time.
Yeah, and as you were saying, we're still seeing so many of those impacts on communities and the health impacts that these plants have. Even with, the fossil fuel derived plastics that we're familiar with today. So can you kind of dig into a little bit about when that transition happened? When did we get into this, petrochemistry based plastic production, and what catalyzed it? I think you hinted at some of those big kind of global forces that really led to that.
So you see the kind of transition of plastics. I mean, I guess like the early generation of plastics, perhaps by today's language, we might even call a bioplastic. The carbon backbone was sourced from living systems. It was either cellulose based, which is another natural polymer, essentially the building block of the plant kingdom, or based on some of these latexes. But they were chemically modified, so they count as semi-synthetics. But we start moving into the beginnings of industrial synthesis of moldable materials as the 20th century dawned. And the kind of first commercially successful version of that was a plastic called Bakelite. Bakelite plastic, let's see, that's like your clunky tabletop phones, the first ones with the receiver, the clunky bangles that climb the arm of Coco Chanel, a lot of car parts and electronics. So, that was kind of commercialized in like the 1910s, for example, weren't really commercial facing. But what's significant about that is the material to make that came through, it was a derivative of coal, essentially, and was so at that point the plastics industry and any of the plastics that are based on this chemistry were essentially tied to the steel industry, which was reliant on the coking industry. And the coking is, for example, it's a processing of coal, such that then when the coke is burned, it can burn at higher heats that are necessary for making steel. But what gets released from those ovens, it can be captured, and the kind of hydrocarbons pulled off of that. And so plastic, like that Bakelite plastic, the phenol for that Bakelite plastic was pulled out of that waste stream. During the interwar years, you see the beginnings, and it has kind of multiple different points of origin of companies either in the petroleum industry or in the chemical industry beginning to tinker with using oil and gas derivatives. And what's interesting for me about this particular time period is that the word petrochemical did not yet exist. Petrochemical is kind of an interesting word in the history of words. It's kind of like email or smog. They're called portmanteaus. Email is electronic mail, or smog is smoke and fog. Petrochemical is like this morphed word that comes together because the industries come together in this interwar period. So you have companies like Standard Oil of New Jersey beginning to figure out what they can do with some of their waste products. One company that I've spent a lot of time looking at is the role of Union Carbide, which is who my father made plastics for, and looking at their work in the 1920s and figuring out how to pull essentially ethylene out of first natural gas and later petroleum. And then what in the heck can they do with it all? And that's something I've written extensively about. And that is history that takes place essentially along the Ohio River Valley, work that begins in Pittsburgh and continues down in West Virginia to really figure out how to pull ethylene out of natural gas, and then how to turn it into things like vinyl plastic. And so after World War II, you see the kind of growth and development of the oil and gas industry, and the growth of this petrochemical alliance, and so you see some of these other uses falling away. Though Germany very much built all of their plastics up through World War II through coal, because that's what they had. And we still see coal-based plastics in parts of China, for example, used to produce vinyl, because that's what they had. So sometimes the industry tracks, just what are the available carbon sources. But historically, it does track the change in the energy systems from biomass to coal to oil and gas, and potentially back to biomass again. And if we don't learn the history, then it could be just as toxic and extracted with human rights violations on the other end, if we don't realize that that was a problem before.
Right. And yeah, like as we have been talking about as we were preparing for this, so much of that was government subsidized, government funded. So there was just a lot of support that the industry had. And you also had mentioned that there's sort of a similar story around PFAS, and how a lot of PFAS chemicals are also being created and coming out of this same timeline. I wonder if you could just touch on that for a couple of minutes, since I know
Yeah,
many of the folks here are also concerned about PFAS and how that ties in with plastics as well.
sure. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like the chemical biography, PFAS, polystyrene, and polyethylene are all, and Teflon, which is a PFAS, but the fluorinated plastic, those are all technologies that kind of came out of the churning of the war, but were very much their research and development were paid for with public dollars. Because they had they were seen as having incredible military value at the time. So we can kind of take those in different sections. Let's go with the PFAS first. I kind of the way that I think about the Manhattan Project, which was the US's effort to build an atomic weapon during World War II, that was the proving grounds for the PFAS chemicals. They were kind of creating kind of fluorocarbon chemistry was a very small subset of chemistry prior to the war, barely, maybe just some research papers going on in that area. But during the beginnings of the Manhattan Project, when the American scientists were trying to figure out how to create a fissile material that would have a chain reaction that would then make a weapon of world-changing magnitude, they came up with a bunch of different ways to essentially create fissile material. One was what eventually got built at Oak Ridge, which was a gaseous diffusion method, which was not going to be possible unless there could be a way to build a factory that could contain a reaction and the chemistry involved in doing that. And so they figured we need wholly different ways to make materials, to make the pipes and the fittings and the gaskets, and so that we can make a factory that can make this kind of weapon. And so through a series of historical connections, they got looped into the possibility that this new fluorocarbon chemistry, which was hardly even a thing, was going to be able to be developed quickly to make the plastics and materials that would be needed to make the factory to make the bomb. And essentially a massive amounts of money poured into research and development for fluorocarbon chemistry. Teflon was already in development at the time at DuPont. It was actually the furthest fluorocarbon technology, in the research and development pipeline before the project began. And it, in the documents, the Manhattan Project had high hopes for Teflon, but it turns out it wasn't quite ready for the prime time, though they got a lot of money. DuPont received quite a bit of money to try to scale production up quickly. But in the meantime, lots of other scientists were brought on board to kind of begin to develop this technology, and indeed scaled fluorocarbon technology or PFAS technology up remarkably during that time period. None of it, was happening in the literature or in patents. They were all under secrecy order. So by the time the war ended, an incredible amount of the early work had already been done. Same with polystyrene. Styrene and polystyrene existed before the war, but its base material styrene was not made in the kind of quantities and practically in the way that it would make sense to make a mass commodity plastic out of it until the war created a demand for synthetic rubber. Styrene was a major ingredient for that. And then, as one Dow advertisement put it, styrene was honorably discharged for a new line of service, and on came polystyrene plastics in a whole new way. Polyethylene came through the same track. It was developed in England. It was first used for radar cabling. The United States military negotiated a contract to get that technology in the US. Two companies were given a leg up to start manufacturing, and now we have polyethylene in the United States. Again, the war put these plastics on in solid footing so that they could take off when the war was over.
That's a really fascinating history. And I think we're going to actually drop some additional resources on PFAS in the chat for folks here too. But as you've been describing this, there's clearly a lot of broader forces at play that drove the use of plastics, but it sounds like it really did start out in this very industrial, mechanical machinery war complex space, but that has obviously shifted. And at some point we saw the creation and adoption of more single-use plastics. And along with that came this mindset of disposability. So how did that happen? Because I think that's what we are grappling with the most when we think about plastics today, is just how throwaway they are, how ubiquitous they are.
Yeah, there's some very interesting history about the kind of convergence of multiple factors that led to disposability really taking off in the afterwar years. There's a wonderful book called Waste and Want by Susan Strasser, which talks about the advent of disposability. What kind of was really, it was some of the metal industries and the paper industries that led us towards disposability. And then plastics really glommed on to the concept of being able to get repeat buyers or repeat customers if you were creating products that were designed to be thrown away and purchased again. After the war, for example, polyethylene, right now we have it in the United States. We have DuPont making it, we have Union Carbide making it, and then like 12 other companies were like trying to get in on the license, but it wasn't really clear what they were going to make out of it. And one of the first manufacturers to really glom onto polyethylene was actually Mr. Tupper of Tupperware. But that was a durable good, right? Like at some point you hit saturation. Like you can only sell so many Tupperware bowls once everybody has one. So you start to see in the plastics internal conversations, like when they're talking to themselves at conferences and the like, that the future of plastics is essentially, quote, in the trash can. If you want to grow this market even more, we have all this surplus ethylene capacity. We have all this styrene capacity. We have all this, factories that were making all of this war material. What are we going to do now? It became disposability or creating products that were designed from the beginning to be disposable was part of that. And so then that had to be taught. Disposability was kind of a new idea, kind of born during the Depression and during World War II. And it very much ran against the ethos of a society that was quite frugal. And so you see advertising actually kind of like directly instructing, just throw it away, just toss it away. I mean, actually kind of providing the step-by-step how to do that. At the same time, you also see huge shifts coming across, particularly in the United States, with how people bought food. And you see the advent of the supermarket, and the changes just prior to that was the advent of thin, clear plastic films and starting to package, pre-package essentially before sale foods. And so shopping became essentially a self-service, instead of you going into a bakery and saying, I'd like that piece of that loaf of bread, and you go to the butcher and you say, please wrap that piece of meat up. Now they're all wrapped in clear cellophane or later fossil carbon based films, and it became you just grab it for yourself. And then packaging not only was a throwaway, but it became like, how do you sell food? How do you distinguish your bread from somebody else's bread? And now it's a container for marketing, for branding, and for differentiation, and for flagging customer attention. And so that also was a whole nother category of essentially throwaway items that really grew the plastics marketplace, and changed how food was even available, made available to whole communities.
The marketing side of that is so fascinating to me. I've definitely seen ads from that time period where it's like a happy hostess just like sweeping all of her disposable plates into the trash because you can just buy new ones. So it's just wild to think about the shift, the mindset of society that came out of that really concerted effort to market these products to us. I'm curious if you could share, how do you think that we kind of fight back against that mindset? Like, how as a society do we break this cycle of disposability?
What has been so fascinating for me in the research literature is how much this has been critiqued publicly from the beginning. Like, I don't know if there's ever been total buy-in. Like, many of you probably have seen this picture. It's a very famous picture. It's often shown. It was originally taken from Life magazine, and it's a family of three, a white family of three, and they're throwing their things up in the air. And I think the headline reads like "Throwaway Living," and it was from like a small feature in Life magazine, 1955. And it's often marked as kind of like the hallmark of the beginning of disposable culture. And if you look at the items that are actually like arrayed in that photo, or actually you can go into the archives and see the all of like the B-roll, like what Life did print from that. And you can see all of the items. A lot of them aren't plastic yet. They're still mostly paper and metal. There's some plastic, but they're not. But if you go to the next issue of Life magazine, you will find in that issue a letter to the editor critiquing, why are you celebrating this? Why is this a good thing, this throwaway living? And I found that remarkable. Here's another interesting tidbit from history. The plastic bag, like the grocery bag, like the handle, like made out of one continuous piece of plastic, that was developed in Europe before the United States. And it like had almost like majority market share on the continent. At the point in which it was being first introduced into United States markets. So that would be like late 70s, early 80s. And at the time that it was being pushed into the US marketplace, it was already being challenged in Sweden. It was already being challenged in Germany. And like there's historians who've documented the public comments of complaining about the environmental hazards of bags. At the same point, the trade associations in the United States were trying to get bags in here. And even within a few years of all those plastic bags being pushed into US markets, there was a lot of resistance. And we have a first bag ban attempted in 1988. I mean, it gets fought back by the Flexible Packaging Association pretty quickly as a symbolic victory to try to be like, oh, communities, you shouldn't do this. But that challenge has always been there. The other thing that's in the historical literature that I think is really important to know is that the plastics industry was complaining about how hard it was to convince people that goods were disposable. Like they had to really fight to kind of overtake that. And so I feel like there's something really there to knowing it. Those aren't the stories that we tell ourselves about plastics. We are more tend to kind of tell the story as the industry wants it told, as it told it to us in the advertising. Like, look how convenient it is. Just throw it away and be done with your party. But these stories are also part of the history of plastics, and we tend not to tell them as much, which is one in which there's been a lot more reticence about its uptake and a lot more criticism about its implications. So that's one. And two, I think it really goes to show that a lot of these decisions are being made much higher than at the level of the individual, even though much like this idea of the carbon footprint has been put upon people. This idea of littering and being better consumers has been put upon people, but really it's about phenomena that are happening at much higher levels of organization in terms of how our choices are shaped. And so it goes to show, like, that's the level at which we can operate to try to influence the change, is to push back at the brands and the stores, because they're really who are plastics consumers. And they're the ones making the choices about how to package their goods.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to touch on another story that the industry tends to tell, which is that, we as consumers are responsible for recycling all of our plastic products, and that's gonna prevent plastic pollution, which, evidence shows that they knew that that really wasn't the case as early as the 1970s, but that was still the solution that they were pushing for decades. Um, so how have we come as a society to sort of reframe our understanding that this is not a problem at the individual level, but it's a more systemic problem that we're starting to address, and how are we doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's incredible work being done by NGOs and particularly by frontline communities to remind those having these conversations at the highest level, at decision-making levels, is that, plastics are more than just products. They're actually complex systems of chemicals. Like, plastics is a system, like, held up by toxics, and we have to address them as such. And so, one thing that I've been watching as the United Nations negotiations towards a plastics treaty are proceeding is watching this very reframe happen kind of in real time, from thinking that plastics is just this waste issue to kind of remembering that plastics is actually a human health and a human rights issue. And it's always been, because even if, let's say, even if we just kind of address the single-use plastics issues or reduce that, we still haven't dealt with the toxicity of the plastics. We haven't dealt with the toxicity of the communities living near plastics production are living with and have lived with since the advent of this industry, or the human rights violations that go on up and down the entire supply chain. And so I think there's been a much broader understanding of what constitutes plastic pollution than just kind of what's most visible or most readily observable, for example, on a shoreline.
Yeah, and I think really recognizing that supply chain that you mentioned and all of the impacts that that has along the way are really critical to think about as we talk about the plastics problem. And I want to just take a couple minutes now to kind of dig into that a little bit more, about that impact that some of these plastic producing facilities can have on local communities. And I'd like to share an example with the audience here today that's coming out of Beaver County, Pennsylvania, which is near Pittsburgh. And as a bit of background, in 2022, Shell opened a plastic producing ethane cracker plant. And this is in an area that's already facing some of the worst air quality in the country. And this plant that they've set up is slated to produce 3.5 billion tons of plastic pellets a year. And much of that is destined to become single-use plastics. And in the process of creating all of these plastic pellets, it's releasing unbelievable amounts of toxins and chemicals into the air. And the plant has already blown through its permitted emissions caps, and it shows no sign of slowing that down. So Food and Water Watch has been working with local community members and ally groups as part of a coalition called Eyes on Shell to hold Shell accountable. So what I'd like to do now is just play a short video from one of our volunteers and an Eyes on Shell activist. Her name is Rachel Esham, and she's a nurse who lives in the Beaver County area near the Shell plant. So let's just take a minute to hear what she has to say.
I live in Center Township, about 2 miles away from the cracker plant. And, the air quality around here is terrible. It is. And it's bad pollution. It's going into the soil, the water, the air. And because we can't see it necessarily, but we can feel things, we can get headaches and our eyes burning, and we just may not feel right. We may be off, we may be listless. everywhere in Pittsburgh's polluted, and the closer you are to the action, the worse it is. And when the cracker plant kicked off, because I'm in a direct line 2 miles away on the main street here, my water started turning yellow, orange, sometimes brown, and there was rocks coming through. And that wasn't normal. And I knew this was directly related to the cracker plant because it was not an issue before. I went round and round with the Center Township Water Authority, and of course they're denying it. When the cracker plant was first opening, the local government was all for it, and this is going to be great, this is going to bring in jobs. And then about 3 years ago, everything just fell silent. Then I found out that everybody has shares in the cracker plant and there's investment. So it's just, once again, government corruption where nobody cares. So they're washing our hands of it. And then, of course, when I tried to contact them, there was no call back or contact. And then I went to the town hall meeting. I wish I could have got more information. It makes me more neurotic when the meeting's over, because you learn so much. You learn things that aren't put out there. But I appreciate it. And of course, I'm going to go and tell anybody that's listening, because it's important to know. All that stuff, it just travels. It runs through the water, through the soil. If the plant closed today, there would still be problems eternally with the water, with the ground, with the sky. But it's going to keep building on itself more and more as the years go on. My husband has already had cancer from prior exposure to things. And it's just adding to it. Like, everyone in this area is going to have cancer. The ideal thing would be to move, but you can't. In today's world, you just can't pick up and move. It's just not feasible. But I would love for it, which would be to just shut down the plant entirely. It's on the news and you see there's fire down there and it's burning off additional stuff. And I know that they go through their yearly allotted amounts monthly, and it's cheaper to pay the fines than it is to fix the problem. So it's nice to have a community with the eyes on shell, with people that do care and do dig deep and find things out and expand on that, because somebody has to. It feels good to have people standing up for something. And in this case in particular, I feel like it really helps out the local community, because you need to have a voice. When you don't have a voice, it's just, you crumble, because it sucks to hear from the water company, oh, this is just some crazy person going off about the water. It's validating that, hey, like, you're not by yourself. There's other people that are standing here with you that are going to be loud and are going to fight and keep going with it. And for any cause, that's what's needed.
All right. I want to thank Rachel for sharing her story with us. It's hard to hear the impacts that her community is facing. And, this is an ongoing fight. The fight against this plant is still continuing. In May of last year, we did successfully pressure Shell to pay $10 million for its permit violations, and that'll be put towards environmental projects in the area. And that is a huge victory, but it's still, not enough for those communities who are living with this every day. And as Rachel said, the legacy that it will have for years and years to come. So Food and Water Watch is going to keep fighting with our allies in the region to, ultimately shut down this Shell cracker plant. And I'll just remind everybody that any donation that you make today will be matched 3 to 1. So that's 4 times the impact that you can have on stopping the plastic crisis at the source by taking on plants and corporations like this. And yeah, Rebecca, I know that you have also done just a really extensive amount of research on this area in particular, and are very familiar with the Ohio River Valley and the industry that has, really sprung up from there. So just wanted to see if you had any commentary to add.
If you were to look aerially at this Shell complex, like Google Earth view, the size of the complex is it is massive. if you look just to the side of it is one of these tiny World War II era facilities that the government funded to make butadiene and styrene for rubber production, as we talked about before, which after the war transferred to the Koppers company to make polystyrene plastics. And just like to see these two side by side, you can really see the exponential growth in not just the facilities themselves, but in their output. It's kind of unbelievable the way that those two factories in tandem appear. One of the things I've been thinking a lot lately is about this idea of like non-essential use plastics, and what would it mean to begin to curtail plastic production and to curtail the development of new or expanded, plastics production facilities. What would that look like? And that's kind of one of those things that are being actively discussed this week in Ottawa as part of the United Nations process. The United Nations is currently negotiating towards a treaty to end plastic pollution. They're still trying to make sure that plastic pollution is defined not just as a end of a kind of end of life issue, but something across the life cycle of plastics. And one of the things on the table is it possible to kind of ramp or turn off the tap, ramp down production, because while some plastics are now essential to certain parts of certain segments, certainly we can begin to identify those that are non-essential for the health and well-being of societies. And so what would it look like to kind of, is it possible to have a future in which there's no more facilities like that one built at that scale?
Yeah. And kind of keeping in that vein of what do we want to see for ourselves in the future, I'm curious, based on your research of, where plastic has come from and the corporate players and government policies that have really made it so commonplace, what do you see as the pressure points that we can lean on to really make a difference and address this problem?
I mean, some of the work that's going on now, like for those of you who really want to see kind of how the scientific community is thinking about plastics and what's possible, you might like to also follow the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. It's a mouthful, but they're out there putting great 2-pagers together on this and are delivering interventions at the United Nations now, including on this concept of like, how can we come up with this idea of a non-essential use? How as we as society can we get there? They're also working on issues of transparency. What is being made in these plants from a chemical safety perspective? What's being transported on the rails between plants from a chemical safety perspective? But also what's going into plastics products from a safety perspective? And is there a way to eliminate the most troubling polymers, but also additives of concern? Can we get to a simpler list of plastics that are just as functional for essential uses? In essence, what the public is asking is, can we be involved in having a say in how much plastic is made and how it is made, such that it can be made in a way that it does not sacrifice entire communities for its production. So I think there's a lot of room, particularly in the United States, to begin writing letters to the State Department and asking the United States to step up. There was an incredible piece by NPR this past week about where the United States is in this process and why they are not taking a more decisive leadership role. And so writing to the State Department, it would be huge. Because this is an active area of discussion right now. Another active area of discussion is subsidies, and this is one that has been played out in Pennsylvania in the siting of that particular facility in Pennsylvania. It was kind of welcomed with all kinds of tax breaks, and that is research that's actively happening now to understand the extent to which the industry has been given these kinds of legs up in terms of just how their basic raw materials are priced, how energy is priced, how they're lured to certain areas with tax incentives, military and other government contracts, giving them business when they're getting started. I mean, that's another area, another leverage point, is to really look at how much public money is going into keeping these places going and keeping plastics seemingly profitable, even though most of their costs are put onto society to bear. So those are kind of like the top level. At the kind of medium level, it's really about thinking about the purchasing practices of larger institutions, including potentially your education systems and your religious institutions and your communities. What kinds of purchasing are going on at that kind of next level up that can be potentially rethought to figure out, how do you meet the human needs? How do you provide services without necessarily relying on disposable plastics to meet those services?
Yeah. And I'll just jump in with another way that people can take action that I'll make sure I touch on again before we close. But the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is a proposed piece of national legislation that would really put into place policies to ban certain types of single-use plastics and really hold these plastic producing corporations accountable for the damage that they're doing. And I also just wanted to say, I think it's really heartening to hear what you just described, that there are some of these bigger conversations that are happening right now. Like, as you were saying, there was pushback from the beginning, but it didn't really have the momentum to get anywhere as hard as they were trying. And I think we're seeing so much of that happening now, and with success. So I think that that's a really, that gives me hope, at least, that together as a society, we are getting louder and we are making a difference. I'm curious if you could share, maybe if there are any things that give you, we've obviously been fighting this problem for a long time, but what gives you hope that we are going to keep going forward with this and get across that finish line?
Oh my gosh, there's just such incredible passion coming out of the interventions being delivered in Ottawa. I've been glued to them, listening to people who live along all of plastics life cycle, including those who work in the informal economy as waste pickers. I mean, such passionate voices for change, and such incredible stories about their relationship with this material and how they would like to see it shaped going forward. Folks from the Arctic talking about the global migration of plastic particles into their environs and foods. I mean, it's just it's really become a global conversation, and there's such an incredible alliances forming. And because it is such a complicated issue that touches on human rights, touches on human health, touches on biodiversity, touches on climate change, and including the plastic industries kind of going to gobble up too much of the remaining carbon budget if they keep going in this direction. There's so many points of intersection to come together and kind of amplify each other's work, whether you're coming at this from the perspective of environmental justice and frontline communities, or climate, or biodiversity, or human health and food and water safety. I mean, they're all plastics issues, and that's very clear.
Yeah, they definitely are such intertwined issues, and I think it's really amazing to see that so many different people are working on this in some way, because it is all interconnected. We have a couple minutes here, and I do have a few closing reminders that I want to do before we wrap up, but let me just jump in and maybe take one audience question that was submitted. She's asking, you've been researching plastics and the plastics industry for years. Is there something that it really surprised you to learn or changed how you previously thought about these issues?
Oh my gosh, I'm surprised every day about how connected everything is. Something I'm surprised about. For a very long time, the plastics issue, like I started working on this in 2002, right? I can't believe the conversation has gotten to where it is. I mean, that it's a major global issue being talked about at the highest levels of international governance. I mean, it was a pretty lonely place to be studying plastics in 2002, because everyone's like, recycling's got this, like And I was mostly focused on the toxics end, and I couldn't thread it all together. I couldn't understand how it all connected. But all of those connections have become very clear over the last 20 years. And most of all, like I'm surprised that I have been able to do this work at all. Like that I could find a voice in a community in advocating around this. It's been such a blessing in my life, as hard of an issue as it is to work on. I've met the most incredible people. How surprising is that? You know, the connections that plastics threads, it like weaves a web of us. It's not, you know, I mean, the sea turtles are ensnared in the nets, but who's ensnared in plastics is us, and we are all in this and working to address it. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, yeah. That's honestly one of my favorite things about Food and Water Watch, is that we have just such an incredible community of people, all of whom are here with us today, who are just so ready to engage and roll up their sleeves and really tackle this problem alongside us. And, you know, it wouldn't be possible without our members. So just grateful for everyone who's here on this call today. And really grateful to you too, Rebecca, for joining us for this conversation. I think it's just so important, the work that you're doing to really just dive into this history and bring to light what we're up against and all of these different connections, so that we can start to see these puzzle pieces falling into place and know how to then channel our power into those solutions that are going to get us to a plastic-free world. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you. And I see so many questions in the chat, and I'm sorry I haven't had a chance to really get to many of these, but thank you all for your engagement, and hopefully I'll see you on the socials. If I can answer stuff there, let me know.
Yes, absolutely. And I am going to just run through a couple ways that people can take action before we wrap up today. So stick with us for 1 or 2 more minutes, and we'll run through some of those as a group. So first, as we were mentioning earlier, the Break Free from Plastics Pollution Act is a piece of national legislation that would ban a lot of single-use plastic products that are not recyclable, and would require producers of packaging, plastic packaging, to create waste management problems, as well as cracking down on production companies like Shell, who we heard about earlier from Rachel, and really hold those polluters accountable. So the way that you can help support this legislation is by reaching out to your member of Congress and urging them to support the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. So we're going to put a link in the chat where you can do that today and send your own message. And then I do invite you, if you are free tomorrow, to join us again tomorrow evening, Thursday, April 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, for our Plastic Action Volunteer Team Kickoff. There are a ton of ways that you can get involved locally and nationally, and you can sign up to join us at this event to learn how you can get plugged in. And then if you are interested in joining us here again for this conversation, you can come back in June for our next Livable Future live event. And then finally, I just want to thank everybody here who has made a gift today as part of our Earth Week campaign to fight the plastic crisis. These are really long-term fights, and this change doesn't happen overnight. But the change that we're working toward will have direct and long-lasting impacts. And we're really committed to keeping the pressure on these polluting industries and pushing for this legislation. And your donation really increases the impact that we can have. So thank you all so much for your generosity in this fight. And that's all for today, as we've come to the top of our hour. As I mentioned, we did record the conversation, so I'll be emailing that out to you all tomorrow, along with a roundup of the resources that we shared today. And I'll also be including some links to some of Rebecca's fascinating articles. I really, really encourage you to take the time to check those out and just dive even deeper into some of the stuff that she touched on with us today. So thank you all again. I hope everyone has a really wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Kate.